Welcome back, everyone. So as we begin, let's recap last week, which was on Genesis chapter 24. And that was the last story that we were going to talk about for the stories of Abraham. And that was Abraham's focus on the next generation that was coming as he was preparing for his death, as people always, for all times, have done, and back in the day, how they did it then, is he would make sure that his affairs were in order, especially for the inheritance, especially being someone who was the head of a tribe, the head of a clan, the head of a family. He had to make sure that all of his possessions, because he was very wealthy, very blessed, he had to make sure that it passed on to the one whom he designated. And so part of that is ensuring that Isaac, his son, married within the family and did not leave the land. And so in chapter 24, what we saw with when Abraham made his servant swear to him, he told him, "Make sure you do not take a wife for my son from among the Canaanites." That was number one. Number two, by no means are you to let him leave the land. Do not take him out of this land. And so those two things, as we looked at, were to play a significant role in the rest of Israel's history. This endogamy, this marriage within the nation, and staying within the land. And so it played a major role, especially when the Babylonians came along and there was exile and there was mixing of people with other nations in the land of Israel. So those became two very important points for the readers of the biblical stories. So, and then what we also looked at, what we emphasized last week, was the conventional scenes that we find in the Bible. And what we meant by that was these are scenes that follow the same pattern for different characters. And the scene that we looked at last week was the marriage scene or the betrothal scene. And so what we saw there was there's usually a set pattern for how these things take place. Just like how I had mentioned, there's a set pattern for the story of the damsel in distress. Prince Charming goes and saves her. There's a set pattern to these things that we expect. We expect to see certain elements take place. And if one of those elements is missing or if it's changed, we will notice it because we're so used to that pattern story. In a similar sense, the ancient Israelites, when they were reading these stories in the scriptures, they had heard tons of stories like this. They knew the pattern. And the pattern here that was supposed to happen is the main character travels to a foreign land. He goes to a well. He meets a girl. He probably saves this girl by, from some people who are trying to keep her, or from an obstacle like a rock, a giant stone. And he draws water for her. She runs home, tells the news to her family. They invite the man, and they get engaged and they get married after a meal. And so when you compare what we saw in chapter 24 to that expected pattern, some very significant differences become obvious. And one of them is that, to start off, Isaac is not the one who travels to the foreign land. Instead, it's he has a surrogate, Abraham's servant. So Isaac was completely passive. And then when the servant is there, it's not the servant who draws the water, but it's the girl. So that emphasizes Rebekah's very active, independent role in the stories. That was her character. And we also saw that there was lengthy dialogue, a huge repetition. And I had mentioned that that possibly served to emphasize God's kind providence, because God's name and God's actions are brought up multiple times in the story and in the repetition. So, and we noticed that God's activity was not this direct intervening. He didn't directly speak. He didn't directly act. But the characters attributed it to these things happened obviously because it was God's doing. And so that's what we should say nowadays as well. We should recognize God's hand. Excuse me. We should recognize God's hand in things, in everything that is going on around us. Some things are just so coincidental that it just had to be the Lord guiding it, even though we can't directly attribute it to, the chair moved by itself or something like that. Okay. So look for those pattern scenes, look for those repeated scenes, those repetitions, and compare them to each other, because then we will understand the stories on that much of a deeper level. All right. Now, as we begin the stories of Jacob this week, we'll look at Genesis 25, the last half. Before we begin, let's say a prayer. Our Lord and God, we come before you, Father, in reverence and fear, asking for your grace and your kindness. We pray for your Spirit to fill us, Lord, to instruct us in the way that you would have us walk. We pray for your guidance and your wisdom by the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen. Okay, so as we begin the stories of Jacob, we are now exiting the stories of Abraham. And one of the things that's interesting to note in the stories of Jacob is that it seems to completely pass over Isaac. Isaac almost has no role, no independent role whatsoever in the Bible. The only instance where we see Isaac have an independent role is in Genesis 26. And that chapter, oddly enough, occurs after the birth of Jacob and Esau and the selling of the birthright, which is what we're going to look at tonight. So after we have already entered into the story of Jacob and Esau, then oddly, then the story of Isaac appears, the only story that Isaac seems to have any independent role. So Isaac seems to have been completely surpassed almost entirely, except for small roles here and there. So what we're looking at next is we looked at a series of stories about Abraham. And now the way I'm going to think about it is we're looking at a series of stories about Jacob. So it'll go, the stories of the patriarchs is Abraham, Jacob, and then Joseph. And so those are the three main characters we see in the patriarchal narratives. Now, as we look at Jacob's stories, I'm just going to briefly give you an overview before we delve into the introductory story, which is, this is going to be concerned with the promise, just as the entire book of Genesis, especially after chapter 12, deals with, or I guess only after chapter 12, deals with the promise of God to the patriarchs for blessing, for descendants, and for occupation of the land. And so we're going to see that theme is going to continue in the stories of Jacob. We're going to see strife near the beginning and near the end of the stories of Jacob, chapter 25, and then in later chapters, which will be, so the story of Jacob starts in 25 and ends in chapter 35. And we see there's strife between Jacob and Esau at the very beginning in chapter 25. And then that strife is resolved near the end, which is in chapter 33. And so we see at the beginning and end, it's framed by Jacob's strife with his brother Esau. This is family strife. And then in the middle there is when Jacob flees from Esau and he goes to a foreign land. He's essentially exiled. And so this is going to be a very common theme that the audience, the biblical audience, would resonate with, because they the threat of exile is right at their doorstep, or they're in exile, such as the Babylonian exile. So this is a very poignant theme for them, this being exiled from the land. But no matter what, God's promise continues with those who are exiled. And so that's going to be a theme in Jacob's stories as well. And we'll see in Joseph's stories. So even though Jacob has to flee to a foreign land, he's running away for his life, God is still with him, God still protects him, and God still blesses him abundantly in that foreign land. And so right in the middle, we get the story of Jacob and Laban. Jacob marrying Rachel and Leah and having children, becoming prosperous, and then finally returning. And again, exile and return from exile is an extremely important theme in the Old Testament. So that's a very broad overview of the stories of Jacob. And it's fitting that Jacob is the one that undergoes these events, because the nation that comes from him will be named after him, Israel. So what Jacob undergoes, as I've mentioned before, what the patriarchs undergo is representative of what will happen to their descendants. So what happens to their ancestors, the character of their ancestors, reflects what happens to their descendants. It reflects the character of the descendants. So it's fitting in that sense. All right, now, as we begin Jacob's stories, we will look at Genesis 25, 19 through 34. And so what we see is it's going to be broken down into 3 sections. The first section is the first 2 verses, 19 through 20. That's the genealogical introduction that introduces the entire segment series of Jacob's stories. Then in 20 through 26, that's the birth of Jacob and Esau. And then lastly, 27 through 34 is Esau selling his birthright to Jacob. And so let's begin in verse 19. It reads, These are the generations of Isaac, son of Abraham. And remember, this is the formula that we see 10 times throughout the book of Genesis. It's actually a little more, but essentially it's 10 times. And so this marks the beginning of a new section, the beginning of a new character plot. And it says, these are the generations of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. So this is like the genealogy like we saw earlier. This is the introduction to Jacob's stories. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. And so interestingly enough, what we note here is that, recall in genealogies, the usual way it goes about it is it says, like in chapter 5, when Noah was 500 years old, then it tells you who he begot. He begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But in this case, it doesn't do that. It doesn't say when Isaac was 40 years old, he begot. Instead, it tells you whom he married. And so this very subtle shift might indicate to us that it's highlighting, and yet again, it's highlighting Rebekah's role in Isaac's life. Isaac's life does not immediately pass on to his descendants, to his children, but that moment in his genealogy is defined by his marriage to his wife, Rebekah. And then that brings us to the actual story. This is the second section in verse 21. It reads, Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebekah conceived. So we see the repetition of yet another major theme in the book of Genesis, which is the barrenness of the wife, or barrenness of the primary wife. We saw it with Sarah in Genesis chapter 11. That characterized the entire segment, the entire story of Abraham was characterized by the barrenness of his wife. That was the main obstacle that had to be overcome in Abraham's stories. He was promised a son, a natural born son by his main wife, Sarah. And so throughout the story, there are all these obstacles and there's all these potential solutions, but ultimately it all hinges on Sarah conceiving and bearing the promised son, Isaac. And that only comes near the end of Abraham's stories. That only comes in Genesis chapter 20 or 21, I believe, excuse me. But what we see here is, yes, it continues the theme. Rebekah is also barren, and Isaac has to plead on her behalf to the Lord so that she will conceive. But note, she conceives not after 10 chapters. She conceives in the very same verse that it says she was barren. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebekah conceived. So in the same verse where we find out she's barren, we find out she conceives. So obviously, the issue of barrenness, of childlessness, is not the main issue in Jacob's stories, like it was in Abraham's stories. There's going to be a different focus in the stories of Jacob. Now we come to verses 22 and 23. But the children struggled in her womb, and she said, "If so, why do I exist?" That's one possible translation. She went to inquire of the Lord. Now note here, Rebekah, again, is the one who takes the initiative to go and inquire of the Lord. She goes to ask God, why is this happening to me? Again, that's another point of Rebekah's character. And the Lord answered her, verse 23, "Two nations are in your womb, two separate peoples shall issue from your body. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." And so what we see here is automatically, it tells us explicitly, God tells us explicitly that these two children who are in Rebekah's womb actually represent two nations. They are going to be two separate peoples that will separate, that will split off from her womb, from within her. And they're going to become two entire nations. And not only that, but these nations are going to be struggling with each other. They're going to be at war. They're going to be grappling. They're going to be fighting. There's going to be strife. And so this is one of the main characteristics of Jacob's story, strife with Esau. And we are told that one people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And so clearly, as we read this story, and as the ancient Israelites read this story, they would know exactly who they're talking about. And we'll get to that in a moment. We know Jacob represents Israel, and we'll get to who does Esau represent. And so, again, this is another common theme in the book of Genesis, which is fraternal strife, brotherly strife, brotherly struggles. The first example was in Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. And so the story of Cain and Abel will kind of color how we view brotherly relationships later on in the other stories, including this one. So we should probably have that in the back of our mind. When you see the same theme, automatically that means think back to where it occurred before and compare it to what's going on right now. Because by comparing similar themes, similar stories, as I've tried to show in many other lessons, by comparing similar stories, you get much more information about what the authors are trying to tell us. So, the older shall serve the younger. This also reminds us of the Genesis chapter 9, when Noah pronounces a curse upon Canaan, the son of Ham. And he says, may Canaan be a slave to his brothers. And so in a similar sense, this brotherly strife, we saw it there as well, occurs here. And again, the younger is the one who comes out on top. Okay, and one last note on these verses is that if they're already struggling in the womb, then that tells you something significant and deeply ingrained in these two characters. It is a part of who they are. You could probably think of it as it's like a part of their DNA. They are characterized by strife, and so will their descendants be as well. So, all right, that brings us to verse 24. When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. And so this confirms automatically what God had just said. There are two nations in your womb, and we see, oh, look, there are two twins. So clearly that's confirmed. Now in 25, the first one emerged red, like a hairy mantle all over. So they named him Esau. And so there's going to be a lot of plays on words here. Whenever we see birth accounts, there's often going to be plays on words, and we're going to see it here as well. And so the first one, he emerged red. The word for, excuse me. So he emerges red, and he's hairy all over. And so the word for red is Adom. That should sound familiar, like Edom. And the word for hair is Seir, which sounds like Seir, which is Mount Seir, which is in Edom. So clearly we know automatically who Esau represents, what nation he represents, and that will be the nation of Edom, which was southeast of Judah and Israel. And so we can note here that the way the biblical authors viewed these two nations is that they are closely related. Their ancestors were brothers, Israel or Jacob and Esau or Edom. So they're related, but there's strife. And that strife between Israel and Edom will continue. We'll see it continue much later on. And then 26. Then his brother emerged, holding on to the heel of Esau. So they named him Jacob. Now, this doesn't make sense to us because this is another play on words. The younger son, so just imagine this. As the older son comes out, all of a sudden you see this little hand holding on to his heel. And so this is more symbolic than anything, because the word for heel in Hebrew is akev or akeb. So they name him Yaakov, meaning he's grabs onto his heel. And so that tells us something about Jacob's character as well. To grab onto the heel of someone means to betray them. It might be similar to our stabbing in the back, grabbing onto the heel. You betray them or you take their place, you supplant them. It's like treachery. So again, that characterizes Jacob's character. As we'll see, throughout many of his dealings, he deals in treachery and betrayal in a sense. So what these early characteristics tell us about Jacob and Esau is that these characters were a part of who they were even before they were born. There was strife. Esau was hairy, red, and rugged, and Jacob was a betrayer, a deceiver, a supplanter. But notice that what God had said, the one people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So by God's decree, everything that happens after this will line up with what God had decreed while they were still in the womb. So later on, when Jacob kind of finagles Esau into selling his birthright and he deceives his father Isaac, even as questionable as these things may seem to us, that eventually fulfilled what God had originally decreed. One shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And so that brings us to that's the end of the second section. That's their birth. We know who these two characters represent. They represent two nations. They're at strife. One is rugged and one is treacherous. And then we come to a story where they actually are the main actors, starting in verse 27. When the boys grew up, automatically we skip over their entire childhood, and now they're older. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors. But Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah favored Jacob. Verses 27 and 28 set up contrasts between Jacob and Esau, just like we had looked at between Cain and Abel. Two polar opposites. One's a farmer, one's a shepherd. One brings some fruit of the ground, the other brings the best of the best. God favors the one, God doesn't favor the other. So it sets up these contrasts. In a similar way, it's going to set up these contrasts between Jacob and Esau. On the one hand, Esau is a skillful hunter. He's a man of the field. He's a man of the outdoors. We can think of him more of kind of like the tough, the rugged, the more manly, if you will, of the two who's outdoors. But then on the flip side, we have Jacob. There are many different translations for this adjective for Jacob. This version says he was a mild man. Some say he was a plain man. Others say he was a content man. Maybe you can think of it, he was a tame man. He was whole. As opposed to one who's out there rough and tumble, he's kind of sitting, he's indoors. He's more civilized, you can think of it. And he dwells in the tents. He dwells indoors. That's where his dealings are. And these two characteristics are going to continue to unfold. Notice these characteristics were already foreshadowed by their birth. Esau was red and hairy, just like how he is outdoors. Jacob was holding onto his heel, meaning he deals treacherously, he deals shrewdly. He's more of a thinker, if you will. He's more calculating. He's more civilized. And then the second contrast is Jacob loved Esau. Literally, it says, because he had game in his mouth. That just that picture, he had game in his mouth. This version says he had a taste for game. Other versions say something like he was he was good at hunting, or something like that. But literally, he had game in his mouth. That produces a picture in your mind, almost kind of like a wild animal that has another animal in its mouth. He had game in his mouth. Again, emphasizing Esau's ruggedness, his sort of primitiveness. But then it says Rebekah loved Jacob, and it gives us no reason for that. It gave us a reason for Isaac's love, but none for Rebekah's. Something to think about. And then verse 29 suddenly sets the scene. So those two verses were kind of like an introduction to this section. It's like telling you the background, and now we enter the scene in verse 29. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the open, exhausted or famished. So now we can picture this. Jacob is inside. He had boiled some pottage, boiled some stew, and then in bursts Esau, and he's famished. Perhaps he's drenched in sweat. He's exhausted. He's hungry. Again, characterizing who they are. And then Esau says to Jacob, "Let me gulp down some of that red stuff, for I am famished," or "I'm exhausted." Just listen to the language. Remember, since the Bible doesn't give you a lot of details, you need to pay attention to language. And literally what it says, I gave you the literal version. Esau comes in and he tells Jacob, "Let me gulp down that red stuff." Others say just red stuff once, but the word red is repeated twice. This does not sound like a very articulate man. "Give me some of that red stuff. I'm exhausted." Even their language reveals their character. And it says, which is why he was named Edom. So there it explicitly tells us, Edom. Remember, Adom means red. So Edom sounds just like Adom. So we know he represents the nation of Edom. And then Jacob responds, "First, sell me your birthright." But what he says literally is, "Sell today your birthright to me." And Hebrew word order is kind of flexible. So he puts the word "to me" at the very end. It seems very calculated, very intentional. So in bursts Esau, and he says, "Give me some of that red stuff. I'm exhausted." And then we could just picture Jacob calmly just turns to him and he says, sell today your birthright to me. As if he's kind of hiding the fact within the language that it's to him. Very calculated statement. And then in verse 32, Esau says, "I am at the point of death, so of what use is my birthright to me?" Now, people have speculated, was Esau really at the point of death? Was he really so exhausted? Was he really so famished that he was literally about to die if he didn't eat right then? It is highly, highly unlikely. I think that's an over the top interpretation. What we see here is Esau being overly dramatic. Esau is being so driven, so controlled by his what's the word? His primitive feelings, his primitive desires, his nature, that He'll do absolutely anything just to satisfy his hunger and his thirst. And so again, we get the picture of a very brutish man. But Jacob said to him, "Swear to me first." Again, another calculated move. He doesn't take Esau at his word. He doesn't say, he realized that what Esau had said, "What good is my birthright to me?" He hadn't actually given him his birthright yet. He hadn't sold it to him. So Jacob takes the next move and he says, "Swear to me first. Make me an oath first, then I'll give you some." And by doing so, Jacob guarantees that he receives the birthright. And then Esau doesn't even respond. It just says, "So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob." So this seems like another very rash move. It doesn't even give words to Esau. It just says he swore it to him as if he had just done it just to get it over with so he can eat. He's like, yeah, I swear, okay. Then in 34, Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank and arose and went away and despised the birthright. After Jacob gives him the food, we have 5 literally back to back to back to back to back verbs. We have Esau ate, drank, arose, went, despised. It's all, again, very, very abrupt, very rapid. He comes in, he demands, he swears rashly, he sits down, he eats, he drinks, he gets up, he goes, he despises. In and out, he doesn't even give it a second thought. He didn't even say after he ate, he didn't even say, "Wait a second, what did I just do?" He didn't say, "Hey, wait a second, brother, I didn't mean it." It's as if he didn't even give his birthright a second thought. And what it means by birthright is that being the firstborn in that culture, he was to receive everything. He was to receive the entire inheritance, or at least the main portion of the inheritance when the father passed away. He was the one who was to continue to be the head of the family, if you will. He was to own everything. He was to administer everything, be in control of everything after that. Perhaps he was the one to whom the promise would pass on to. Now, I say that hesitantly because God clearly had his plans, and it seems like he clearly had Jacob in mind to pass the promises on to. But perhaps this was Esau's role. That's the part that Esau played in guaranteeing that the promise would go to Jacob. Esau would no longer be the main one that all of the promises, all of the wealth, all of the blessing would pass on to, from Abraham to Isaac to Esau. No, he gave it away just in a very brief moment of being dramatic. And he didn't give it a second thought. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright. So what we see in this story is 2 brothers characterized by strife since they're in the womb. And they represent the nations of Israel and Edom. Remember, the way your ancestors behaved, the character and actions of your ancestors, in a sense, determines your character and your actions. It tells you who you are. By explaining where you came from, you're saying who you are. So Israel is identifying itself in one sense, as this domesticated, civilized, calculating people. And then the nation to the southeast of them, their neighbors, they're these rugged, red, hairy men of the field who are brutish and rash. So, in one sense of the story, this is a political statement for themselves and against their neighbors. But what we can learn from this is that what this story reminds me of Jesus' words: be shrewd as serpents, but innocent as doves. And in this sense here, what we see Jacob doing is Jacob is being very shrewd. But here he does not deceive. He does not lie to Esau. All he does is take advantage of Esau's brutish stupidity. Maybe this was a good thing that happened, because how could the promises pass on to such a man as Esau? He was not worthy of them because he despised them. Maybe he didn't realize how truly precious, how truly great this blessing, this birthright was going to be. He didn't give it a second thought, so he was not worthy of it. But Jacob, he applied his shrewdness, and he earned that birthright fair and square. So as we read through the story, we should learn that just because we view ourselves, since we are people of faith, since we are Christians, we are children of God, we are children of the promise, that doesn't mean that we can just behave ourselves in any such way, this or that. But instead, as Jesus said, be shrewd as serpents, innocent as doves. And interestingly enough, the word that's used for Jacob when it says that Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, it says that Jacob was, remember the translations were iffy. It was a plain man, a content man. This version had a mild man. But that word, almost 100% of the time elsewhere, it means perfect, complete. This is a word that was used of Noah. He was a man of dignity, integrity. And so in some sense here, we see that Jacob is both being shrewd and having integrity, innocent. And that is what we are to be as well. We cannot just say all the time, oh, I can do whatever I want. I can do this or that because God will protect me. God has my back. Which is true. God will protect us, but that doesn't mean we can act rashly or brutishly as Esau did. So with that, I pray that this was instructive, and that I pray that God bless you all.